Hey everybody, it's H, and welcome to the latest installment of Dune Pod, your one-stop shop to get ready for the new Dune movie coming out this fall. This week, I'm joined as always by my co-host Jason.
Good Lord, is like Ted Cruz's intern writing this part of the book?
And we celebrate the triumphant return of visionary poet and spiritualist Protolexus.
You could see Duncan Idaho's corpse being delivered.
On this episode, we discuss the second book in Herbert's hexalogy, Dune Messiah. We explore why bad things happen to good people, what happens when our reach exceeds our grasp, and why no one should ever use the word ruttish. Ever. If you're enjoying the show, please be sure to leave us a rating and a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, as it really helps new listeners find the show. And now, without further ado, Dune Messiah. I couldn't believe the number of movies you watched this last week.
Yeah, I know. I looked at my stats. I think I was at 89 movies for the year, which is insane.
How many, Jason, have you seen this year?
Movies?
Yeah.
You know, we don't watch a ton of movies because, by the time we get the baby down, we've been watching more TV. So I would guess the number of movies I've seen this year is probably, I don't know, under a dozen or something. Maybe.
Most of them for this podcast.
Yeah, most of them for this podcast. We started watching a lot more. We did watch Palm Springs for fun, which I really enjoyed.
Proto, welcome back to the podcast.
It's exciting to get to talk about the books.
This is episode 8. We've been covering, a number of awesome movies by Denis and featuring some of the cast over the last couple of weeks. Tonight, we're covering Dune Messiah Part 1, and we'll do that tonight and next week. And then after that, we'll get back to films. We have a line on a really, really hot guest that will be potentially joining us to discuss Jodorowsky's Dune, which we've been very eager to get to. So stay tuned for more details on that coming up in future weeks. But I want to just very quickly hit Dune news.
Would you like to know more?
Which is to say there was essentially no Dune news this week at all.
Sad. Always sad when there's no Dune news.
There's nothing going on. But I do want to call out Denis Villeneuve was on Roger Deakins' excellent podcast, which is called Team Deakins. Roger Deakins, we discussed a couple of weeks ago, was the cinematographer for No Country for Old Men, as well as for Blade Runner 2049, partnering with Denis for that. And so it was just an incredible discussion of Blade Runner 2049, Prisoners, Sicario that they did together, and then as well as how Denis approaches filmmaking in general, and just a lot of really great details for how he thinks and how he makes films.
Great.
And actually, it was so good, I considered having an episode of this podcast where we reviewed that podcast. But that felt a little too meta.
Never been done before.
Yeah, no.
It's a first for everything. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get straight down to business. Dune Messiah is a future that cannot be escaped, and a history that will never be forgotten. Paul Muad'Dib, Emperor of the known universe, has reigned for 12 years since he seized control of Dune from his enemies, the Harkonnens, and the former Emperor Shaddam IV. Having avenged the murder of his father, he is now the figurehead of a jihad that has brought 10,000 worlds into enlightenment while leaving behind a body count in the billions. With his seductive sister Aliyah by his side, he must face a cabal of powerful forces intent on tearing down his empire from within. Paul must walk a dangerous path, with darkness closing in on all sides, as he looks for a way to prevent the worst outcome at an unimaginable cost. Dune Messiah.
Yep.
So, what's the story with this book? I've heard something about Herbert had originally planned to cover the events from Messiah in the original Dune book, or was there some sort of connection there?
What I know for sure is that, he definitely planned both Messiah and Children of Dune when writing Dune. It was conceived of as a trilogy. And he knew that Dune Messiah was going to be the hardest one to write, because he was going to have to essentially undo some of the awesome character building he did with Paul in Dune, because in Dune Messiah, Paul is hamstrung in a variety of ways and ends up becoming almost an anti-hero. I mean, this is, we're talking about the boy hero of the first novel, who in the second novel is comparing himself to Hitler at one point. So it's a pretty steep decline. And in fact, in the foreword to Dune Messiah, Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert's son, who's also written sequels and all kinds of stuff in the Dune world, notes that the serialized Dune Messiah was, quote, named Disappointment of the Year by satirical magazine National Lampoon. So like Dune was a huge success, right? I mean, it was a very big success in the science fiction world. It's always sold well. And then Dune Messiah was just kind of this wah-wah for everyone. And then it also had been rejected by the editor, John Campbell, that Frank Herbert had published the original with, who loved Dune, but then told Frank Herbert that his readers wanted stories about heroes accomplishing great feats and not stories of protagonists with quote clay feet. And so I think all of this is to say that Dune Messiah is, as Brian Herbert goes on to say, a bridging work, which kind of is this middle act between Dune and Children of Dune. And so it's a complicated piece of storytelling.
Now, Proto, I know you had described Dune Messiah as one of your favorite in the series up as far as you've gotten. What's your sort of like initial take on the book as a whole before we get into it?
Yeah, I'm still reading through the series. I'm in book 5 right now, but I feel comfortable in saying that Dune Messiah is my favorite of the series. Wow. Yeah, I think it's by far the one I enjoyed the most. To me, it felt like the first book is an action adventure story that kind of is written to please the masses, and that this book, Dune Messiah, is more like the books that follow it, and that they're so different from the original book. It almost felt like, the Dune Messiah is like the gateway drug, is the successful book that Frank needed to write so that he could write the stories that he actually wanted to write, where it's mostly character and dialogue driven, where he gets to pontificate on ideas through the dialogue. And you get more of that in this. And it really does, I had read the first book by itself, and I didn't continue on from there. But the way it ends, it really ends on like a cliffhanger. It's now looking back, it seems so odd to read the first book and to not continue. I would say after reading the first 3, it does feel it's almost like reading The Fellowship of the Ring and stopping there and being like, well, that was a good book. I wonder what happens after, and not continuing.
Old Frodo.
Yeah, it's funny. I had the same experience where, like, for this podcast, I reread Dune, and I was like so excited at the end of it. I was like, all right, I know we're going to do Dune Messiah. And so like I plowed right into it, which is now some time ago. And I had like pretty much, the same experience that I had the first time I read Dune Messiah, which was like, I was like, oh, this is kind of sad. This is kind of a bummer. It's definitely not my favorite of the Dune universe. And like I was really into it, like, where it starts. And then I just was like, oh man, like it's kind of a tough hang with Paul, the mopey god, throughout Dune Messiah.
Well, let's just start walking through some of the key things that happen in the book. We're going to have fun covering some of the plot points because there are not a huge number of them in general. But first of all, I love the beginning and to some of what we've just been describing. The prelude of the book opens with one of Paul's jihad priest interrogators, basically torturing and preparing to kill a historian from Ix for heresy, for having basically laid out what's really happened there. So you have from the very beginning this notion of how the religion and law has been fused and how it's being used for massive control. But there is a moment, I don't have the exact line from the book, but there is definitely a piece where Herbert, there's a reference about how people are caught up in Arrakis and the allure of the sandworms and the still suits. And it did feel to me like Herbert was calling out people for getting caught on the trappings of Dune as opposed to the message that he was trying to send there.
Oh yeah, that's kind of good. It's sort of like, because there is an element that like Arrakis has become this pilgrimage site. So it's like sort of become like Disneyland desert world. And he's faulting both the pilgrims, but also the glory seeking readers such as myself, who just wanted more dope Bene Gesserit fighting shit. And less moping / kind of weird incest like hints.
So right after that, we're introduced to the Cabal. These are the folks that are plotting to take him down, right? So we have Scytale from the Tleilaxu, which are basically people who are experts at genetic modification and growing of clones and whatnot. We have the Guild navigators, Edric being the Guild representative, who's one of the guys floating in the gas and partially mutated. We have the Reverend Mother, Helen Gaius, who was in the first book, and then we have Irulan, and them working up a plan. And I loved when they introduced it, the idea of a psychic poison and using the Gola for that purpose.
Love that. I love this opening scene, and I was like hype when I had gone from book one, and I was like, all right, yeah, this is the stuff I'm here for. Like, one of the details it has that is such a good Dune nugget is that they're speaking in this language called Mirabasa, which is noted as being an instrument for conveying fine emotional subtleties. And there's one scene in which, and Eldric's sort of the weak link in this cabal. He like doesn't get what's going on. He's like a little dopier than the others. Right. And at some point, like Scytale makes fun of him, or, some kind of involuted mocking of Edric. And it says like Scytale laughed, and Mirabasa laughter could flay an opponent. It's like, all of this cool language stuff that Herbert always does really well.
So we have the introduction now of the character of Hayt, Hayt, who is a Gola. And so this is somebody who has been grown from the cells of a previous person who died. And the concept is that they can be an exact replica of them, and maybe they have the memories somewhere inside them, but they've never actually, at least as far as the Tleilaxu have said, they have never actually come back to their memories and been reawakened. But it's just an interesting idea, and we have this notion of Duncan, Idaho / Hayt coming back and being this connection both for Paul and to Aaliyah.
This is my favorite concept in all of Dune that I've read so far. This scene where they're walking into the throne room and Paul sees Hayt for the first time. Herbert, he doesn't have a ton of description in his story, but this scene was so vivid in my mind and was so compelling and just amazing as it was unfolding. And Paul seeing him and knowing who he was, and then just understanding this concept that it's Duncan, Idaho, but he's really a clone, and he'll appear just as he was before as Duncan. But Paul knows that this is a trap, which is a reflection of things that happen in these books throughout, of the characters knowing that there's a trap before them, but they don't try to run away from it or get out of it. They say like, well, it's here in front of me, and let me keep it in front of me and go in and see what happens. But that whole scene and the dialogue between them is just incredible.
I love the weak spot of Paul loves Duncan, right? Like, he is one of the trusted family members, as close as any family. And you have, most of the rest of the family has been removed, right? His mother is basically not in this book. Gurney Halleck is basically not in this book. You just have Duncan and Aaliyah and Stilgar and Paul. You also have the idea that the Gola has been specifically imprinted for Aaliyah, so that like they have Aaliyah's number and he's already built in. But you also have the idea, I thought this was interesting, that the Gola, in addition to being based on Duncan, is a Zinsuni, master and is a Mentat. So it's a fundamentally different person, but that it still has aspects that are from the same Duncan.
It also kind of sets up a trajectory for the rest of the Dune books, which is Duncan Idaho as a major character. You kind of never get rid of Duncan Idaho, like from here on out. He becomes almost more important than Paul in the story.
Yeah, and I love it. I love Duncan there. So we're going to be seeing Jason Momoa hopefully for the next 20 years.
Yeah, let's go.
Now we have, after this scene, and again, this is that setup, a callback to Dune of as the reader, we're introduced. We understand what the plot is. We understand what the idea of the betrayal is. We know what it is as well. So there isn't that kind of mystery there. But we are finally introduced to Paul, and he's restless. He's walking the streets. He's in disguise in his still suit. He like walks around like a Fremen of the desert. That in the city of Arakeen, that is his capital, like they're given a wide berth and people don't mess with him. But he definitely is weary and in a lot of pain, and just thinking about, he keeps coming back through the book of this idea of disengage, trying to find a way to get off basically the escalator of where the path is leading him.
Yeah, he's looking for a way out, and he knows he doesn't have this way out. And there's a lot of Paul angst, a lot of different, you can kind of pick, whatever, he expresses it in a variety of different ways, but he despairs at one point. I never wanted to be a god. I wanted to disappear like a jewel trace of dew. He's seeking for escape from this fate that he knows is coming.
When you guys first read this, were you surprised that it ended up where it is with the jihad happening and, all the deaths that he wanted to avoid but wasn't able to, and that it actually did come to fulfillment?
Once we saw how bad things had gotten, I definitely was shocked. And so I have struggled much more with this. And I just finished rereading the book again in preparation for this. And it really hit home for how dark things are in this book.
Yeah, I was surprised, definitely. And this is something that I think when we did the original Dune podcast, I sort of, was struggling with when reading that, is because so much of it is about him trying to avoid jihad. And there's so much of these, I see these visions of, the Atreides banner, over millions of dead, billions of dead, and that must be avoided. And it's nope, not going to be avoided. That's what's going to happen. It happened. It happened in between book 1 and 2, and it was awful. And I do find that surprising.
Yeah, I was surprised by it as well. And I think that's one of my favorite parts of this, is that it really turns the character on its head. Like you were saying, Jason, earlier, that, as you get into this book, you start to feel like, wait a second, are Paul and Aaliyah the villains of the Dune saga now? And should I be siding with the conspirators against them because this guy is actually a bad dude to have in charge here? It really warps your sense of who you're rooting for as you read it, which I love.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about on a previous podcast was, how much I like the second Matrix movie, because it also subverts that sort of notion of the hero as the person you thought it was in part 1 isn't who it is in part 2. I think that's a really cool storytelling technique. And yeah, it does end up, that was Herbert's express intent, was to seduce the reader into believing into a hero. But his actual thematic goal was to show that believing in a hero is inherently problematic. And for Herbert, because his politics were a little weird, the heroes that he was most concerned with were JFK. But whatever. He was concerned with heroes generally.
I think the other thing that is interesting to me is Paul, being trapped on the jihad. Part of this is about the Fremen, right? And the Cabal. The other critical aspect of the Cabal is folks within the Fremen themselves, and that's where we start to get into some of the development here. So Scytale the Tleilaxu face dancer. A face dancer essentially can morph their body and their voice so that they can appear as anyone that they want to. And they have a plot to essentially kidnap and kill a Fremen daughter from the Sietch, and then use that to be able to impersonate that person to deliver a message and basically pull Paul out. That's the core of the plot. But when Scytale goes and he meets with Farouk, who is one of the old Fremen from the old days who knew Paul and was one of the Fedaykin.
How do the Fremen cohorts feel now about Muad'Dib's jihad? Scytale asked. Do they object to making a god out of their emperor? Most of them don't even consider this, Farouk said. They think of the jihad the way I thought of it, most of them. It is a source of strange experiences, adventure, or wealth.
And then he goes on to describe one scene that stuck out to me was after some big raid that had happened and a bunch of people had been maimed and killed. They had this huge party orgy, and like Paul comes and waves and, gives like the cursory blessing, but doesn't actually come down.
You objected to the feast? Scytale asked, speaking from a knowledge of the Fremen orgies which were ignited by spice beer. It was not like the mingling of our souls in the Sietch, Farouk said. There was no Tao. For entertainment, the troops had slave girls.
This was something much more sort of gluttonous. And so you really get a sense of there's a sickness here. This is a real problem.
It's funny. I also noted this scene as one of my favorites, the Farouk Scytale scene. I think it's wonderful. I love Farouk reminiscing about the campaigns and the first time he saw the sea. And then, the way Scytale kind of just kicks ass. It's interesting to note when I was going through my favorite scenes in Dune Messiah, they're all like non-Paul scenes. They're all scenes that don't involve Paul Muad'Dib. But yeah, this is a really good one that it's a really great piece of storytelling because it catches you up on what happened between books 1 and 2 in a way that shows and doesn't tell, and also confounds your expectation and just introduces like this real melancholy sadness of like, oh shit, it went really bad for all these people. And you don't even get to really know all the details about what that was. It's really well done.
Yeah, it's almost, it feels more epic with the less detail that because it allows you to envision, like, oh, these Fremen, they conquered 10,000 worlds. And that's all the information you're really given. But we know enough about them that it's amazing to think. Like, we know how they fight. We don't know how they would invade a planet or what that might look like, but we're given enough detail that it's like we can imagine what it might be like. So yeah, those 12 years you kind of can fill in on your own, and he gives you enough nuggets to like fuel your imagination really well.
So we go from that to sort of like beginning to inspect Paul's bureaucracy. And so we go to Paul's staff, which is a callback to the Leto staff meeting. So Paul's there. He's got, Stilgar's pressing him about some treaty that they're supposed to sign. And you've got Aaliyah there. You have Korba, the kind of head of the Kizarat, which is the religious arm of that. And you just have a lot of, you can see that the Lanzarat is starting to stand up against Paul. He doesn't have a lot of support there. People, really, they don't respect what he's doing. But you have this great description. There's the part where they talk about how one of the groups is calling for a constitution. And you have... Perhaps they could be given the form of a constitution, Chani suggested. It needn't be actual. Deceit is a tool of statecraft, Irulan agreed. And Paul says, there are limits to power as those who put their hopes in a constitution always discover.
Yeah, it's great. There's not a lot. He's not in a very democratic mood, Paul Atreides, at this particular moment of his emperorship.
I mean, let's just take a step back and just reflect on this for a minute, right? This is Orwell's same thing, right? Like, whoever is the oppressed eventually rises up and throws off the oppressor, and then they become the oppressor, right? This is Animal Farm, a tale as old as time.
Yeah, and he's definitely taken on the mantle of oppression. Like, it's he's running the show, and everyone else is going to be under his thumb.
I have a little more notes on the bureaucracy, this notion.
Paul found his attention caught by the signs above doorways, as though he were seeing them for the first time. Speed merchants, wind stills and retorts, prophetic prospects, tests of faith, religious supply, weaponry, propagation of the faith. A more honest label would have been propagation of the bureaucracy, he thought.
He's definitely caught up with this. And you certainly have this idea of the Fremen themselves being corrupted as part of this process. And I think, Proto, you're talking about later books. You certainly have that when you get to Children of Doom and others. Like the Fremen have really fallen away from what they were in the early days with water discipline and strength and all of that. It certainly changes as you get further.
They've gone soft.
Yeah. All right. So the next scene that is one of my favorites is the Aliyah sword training scene.
Yes. This is a good scene.
Go, describe.
Yeah, Aliyah fights this training dummy where you have to best its attack and hit this light. And as you turn the lights on, it gets ever more advanced. And she gets to 12 lights. And no 11, one's ever, I think, 11 lights. And like Paul had never gotten past 8 or something. So she's really in flow here, just fighting the hell out of this training dummy. And just the description of her being in flow, fighting the dummy and the exhilaration of that. It's again, like a lot of good Prana Bindu, Bene Gesserit, superhuman stuff that exists in the Dune universe. And you also are getting a glimpse into Aliyah as like someone who's becoming an adult, as opposed to just Aliyah, the child who killed the Baron in the first book. So it's a great little nugget. It is unfortunately also where at the end of the scene, Paul comes into the room, and there's this weird, like Paul's somewhat attracted to Aliyah in this moment.
Well, she's been naked sword dancing the whole time, right? So that's established. Paul comes in, he throws the dagger through the defenses and hits the thing that shuts it off at distance, like the 1 in a million shot, which he obviously nails. And then Stilgar, Paul, and Aliyah are standing there, and Stilgar is like sweating and like totally nervous because it's super awkward. And Paul then is like, "Oh, whoa, when did you become a woman?"
Yeah. And there's also this other plot that's where the Bene Gesserit they need to preserve the bloodlines, and if nothing else, if they can't get a baby from Irulan, they can't get a baby from Chani, then they're fine if Paul and Aliyah as brother and sister have a baby. And so it's interesting. It's just disturbing because in general, Dune is not a very sexy book. Like there's not a lot of discussion of sex. Whenever Paul and Chani's relationship, despite the fact that, they have 3 kids, I don't think there's ever like a real love scene. Like, there's definitely not a sex scene between the two of them that I can recall. But so when sex comes into the Dune universe, it's just horrific usually. Like the other time in this book where it comes up is when Scytale, in that initial meeting of the Cabal, Scytale makes this kind of offhand internal monologue comment about how he, by some glance or some phrase in Mabasa he's going to issue, is going to get Princess Irulan to wonder what happened to Edric's genitalia as he morphed into a worm because of his like long spice addiction. And it's like, bro, like, why are you talking about, space worm
space junk?
Like, why is that? You don't talk. There's no other time in which sex is discussed until it's just horrific. Like it's either incest or worm penis. So that's an interesting choice. I don't know what that says exactly.
I thought that plot was kind of just like a loose end in the story, or a red herring, because when there's mention of that with the Bene Gesserit, of them possibly, having Paul and Aliyah breed, and then there's that scene like right after, and it's like, okay, something else here is cooking up, but then it kind of dies out. Nothing follows up with that idea at all in the rest of the book.
Yeah, it's true, and it's just like somehow the language that Herbert uses is so. It's just as uncomfortable. At least maybe I'm just too prudish, but I think we can all agree that incest is bad, maybe. But like anyway, so the line from this scene, which I'll just share with our listeners, just to get it all out there, is Paul weighed Stilgar's meaning, reviewed what they had seen here, and his own undeniable male reaction to his own sister. Yes, there'd been a ruttish air about Aliyah, something wildly wanton. What had made her enter the practice floor in the nude and risking her life in that foolhardy way? And it's like, good Lord, is like Ted Cruz's intern like writing this part of the book? Like, why are we doing why ruttish in general? Ruttish is a terrible adjective to include anywhere.
Yeah.
Let alone, and
I think she's supposed to be 15 or 16 or something. Like it's a little much.
It's not great, guys. It's not great.
A little thick. We go from here to Paul trying to teach Stilgar a lesson. And there's some discussion of this, and I don't think I fully grokked what he was going for, but he pushes for Stilgar to pull up the tapes and study Genghis Khan and Hitler. And he's describing the fact that they have killed between 4 million and 6 million people. And this is where Paul says,
At a conservative estimate, I've killed 61 billion, sterilized 90 planets, completely demoralized 500 others. I've wiped out the followers of 40 religions which had existed since... Unbelievers, Corber protested. Unbelievers all. No, Paul said. Believers. My liege makes a joke, Corber said, voice trembling. The jihad has brought 10,000 worlds into the shining light of... Into the darkness, Paul said. We'll be 100 generations recovering from Muad'Dib's jihad.
That's not great. It doesn't seem like it's great for Paul. I mean, it is really, we're talking about like the character who is... It's like, the special boy. It's like, book one is a boy realizes he is special and goes on an adventure like Harry Potter or, any of the other,
Luke Skywalker,
Luke Skywalker, the Narnia kids, like any of it. And in book two, like Luke Skywalker turns out to be worse than Hitler, like killed 61 billion people. It's a big reversal.
well, but not unlike Anakin Skywalker, right? So we're introduced to him as a young child and he ends up, going out and slaughtering thousands of Jedi, right? And enslaving the galaxy. So
yeah,
that's maybe a similar arc.
That's true.
I guess the only gap for me, though, as I hear that, it sounds like Paul, in the first book, he didn't want any of this to happen. In this book, he's regretful that it happened, but you have no idea why he didn't stop it or do something different. Of course, we know that he can see into the future and it would produce something worse, but that kind of feels like a cop-out in terms of storytelling. Like, I would like to know what else could have been if not killing billions of people. What's the other path?
Right. Like if menu option A is the death of 61 billion with a B people, I think it's worth knowing what option B looked like.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, he describes it as the jihad, was going to run no matter what he did. And there is a part where I think Edric was saying he could have just stopped it. He was in control. And he basically says that Seitel describes how he wasn't in control of that.
Muad'Dib has used his jihad, and he didn't use the jihad, Seitel said. The jihad used him. I think he would have stopped it if he could. If he could, all he had to do was, "Oh, be still," Seitel barked. "You can't stop a mental epidemic. It leaps from person to person across parsecs. It's overwhelmingly contagious. It strikes at the unprotected side in the place where we lodge the fragments of other such plagues. Who can stop such a thing? Muad'Dib hasn't the antidote. The thing has roots in chaos. Can orders reach there?"
So maybe it's not so bad.
Yeah, maybe. 61 billion had to die. That's just how it goes sometimes. Sometimes you just have a bad 12 years and 61 billion had to die. Ugh. There's a good description around this point that on the plus column I would like to point out, which is a description of Aaliyah's room. Which I was really into because it has a bunch of like sort of Dune ephemera that is, it's just never answered what any of this means. But it says, this is describing her room. The chamber, oblong and skylighted, contained the gross and subtle instruments which toned a Bene Gesserit adept into ultimate physical and mental awareness preparedness. There were mnemonic amplifiers, digit mills from Ix to strengthen and sensitize fingers and toes, odor synthesizers, tactility sensitizers, temperature gradient fields, pattern betrayers to prevent her falling into detectable habits, alpha wave response trainers, blink synchronizers to tone abilities in light dark spectrum analysis. And it's just like awesome. I don't know what a digit mill is, but I want one. I need to get the digit mills from Ix to strengthen and sensitize my fingers and toes because they are not sensitive enough.
I like to imagine that Frank Herbert, he just had a page in his notebook with all of these different phrases that he had just made up over time. And he's like, you know what? I'm just going to unload in this scene. Just put them all in there.
This is the most wild selection from Sky Mall catalog that you'll ever come across.
Nice. Well, speaking of Aaliyah, we have her and Haight going out into the desert to go look at the body, which is of the Fremen girl who was killed, so that Scytale will be able to impersonate her. And definitely, like, you get a sense of Haight, at least, is taking a very long view on what's happening. And he says, those collisions he cannot prevent, speaking of Paul, he solves. How? In the simplest way, he decides, keeping his friends and destroying his enemies. Isn't that stability? People want order, this kind or some other.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. People want to be, there's like this very kind of, yeah, I mean, like, this is where Herbert's own politics, I think, kind of come into things, which is that he believes systems are evil and that people inherently are going to put themselves into systems because that's just human nature.
Mm.
Those conversations between Haight and Aaliyah, I just love those. The way Haight is written, his answers, answering with questions. It sounds great. It sounds like you're listening to I don't know, like a Buddha master monk who has the world figured out, but it'll only speak in riddles. It's brilliant to hear, and it makes me wonder, like, wow, how did he write this the way he did? His writing, I feel like, really shines in those conversations between those two.
Yeah, I feel the decision to make Haight a Zen Sunni warrior gives him a lot of ability to kind of tap into some more of the Eastern mysticism religious stuff that he was flirting with in the first book, just now more explicitly because he has a character who's like, meant to be an exponent of that. There's like some part later where Haight talks about the Zen Sunni philosophy around giving birth, which is to do nothing and let the baby emerge or whatever. Which, having seen one child born doesn't strike me as particularly no, I don't know if that's how it works, Haight, but it sounds like something a dude would say for sure.
Yeah. Paul, again, kind of struggling internally, trying to think about things. He says,
once, long ago, he thought of himself as an inventor of government, but the invention had fallen into old patterns. It was like some hideous contrivance with plastic memory. Shape it any way you wanted, but relax for a moment and it snapped into the ancient forms. Forces at work beyond his reach in human breasts eluded and defied him.
Mm.
It's certainly not the case that he doesn't care, that he's not trying, that he is just being, greedy or thoughtless. But something is just it's not working.
Yeah, it's not coming together.
So the next scene is the Reverend Mother Helen, her audience. And this is part where I think you do show the other side, which was the seduction of Paul. So she describes his palace as being like the size of a city inside his palace and just walking for miles and impossibly large doors and just like huge, like making the mines of Moria look tiny by comparison. And the idea of just completely beating down someone's psyche with the awe-inspiring power of what he has created.
Yeah, I love this description. I love all of this. I love this description.
Ahead of her, finally, loomed double doors centered in the far wall of a tall antechamber. She sensed that the doors were very large and was forced to suppress a gasp as her trained awareness measured out the true proportions. The doorway stood at least 80 meters high, half that in width. As she approached with her escort, the doors swung inward, an immense and silent movement of hidden machinery. She recognized more Ixian handiwork. Through that towering doorway she marched with her guards into the grand reception hall of the Emperor Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, before whom all people are dwarfed. Now she saw the effect of that popular saying at work.
He's just living large. I do like that immediately after he shows up, after she shows up, he's like, "Hey, do you want to like?" He basically goes, "Do you want to get out of here and go to my? I got a little conversation pit in the back that we can have a little more private conversation."
So he offers basically to give the Bene Gesserit his bloodline, right? He's like, I won't let you be the throne, but you can artificially inseminate Irulan, and then you can protect the genetics, you can keep your program running. You're just not going to get the throne. That's mine.
You're not going to get the throne, and you have to agree to IVF, even though that's against your philosophies.
Right. So you have to keep it secret.
Yes, you have to keep it secret. Yeah.
So then we have the moment where Scytale comes in the form of the Fremen girl to have the conversation. And Scytale's like feeling so good. He's got it all figured out, and he's really putting on a fantastic performance. It's just everything is great. And Paul is like, face dancer.
Yeah, this is a face dancer.
Give me a break. And he's acting. Paul is acting and playing along. And yeah. We could do that. But I love that. The Paul is just totally queued up.
It's interesting. Like, it's worth talking about a little, like sort of the nature of prescience and like sort of where Paul has the ability to just immediately see through and be like, oh, that's not a real thing. And like in other places, what kind of, obscures his vision. So like, Edric, the guild navigator, he can't see when people are meeting with Edric because Edric's spice presence is so strong that it messes with his vision. And the other thing they talk about as messing with his vision is this Dune tarot, which is kind of another loose end in the book. Like there's all of a sudden it's very popular in Dune for people to be playing with the Dune tarot, reading the Dune tarot, and this form of prophecy making available to more people is also clouding Paul's prophetic vision because it's a version of prophecy. Basically, when prophecy competes, there's more blindness in the future.
It's super cool.
Yeah,
like I absolutely love that idea that the tarot coming up is clouding things, and there's some collective unconscious. There's some layer that people thinking about and tapping into that prescience are creating interference with each other. I love that idea.
Yeah. I love it too. And we'll get more into it on the second half of this book. But throughout this whole story, we're hearing Paul, and like you're saying, he's moody and he's brooding, but this is all because he knows what is to come down the road. And the way this is intertwined through the whole book is really cool, where Frank doesn't outright say it, that, he knows what needs to happen to him. But he's always, he's hinting at it to people around him. He'll never just like outright say it. And you have like this sense of Paul, being trapped and like almost trying to figure out this puzzle of seeing into the future and working out all of these things, while some things are murky and there's details that he doesn't have, and he's trying to sort it out. But he's also like this incredibly powerful being at the same time. I just love how his mind is constructed in this, and his attitude towards other characters, and how he communicates with them and plans things out. It's just so well done.
We talked about it in the first episode, the fact that Paul, all of his sliders are set up to 10. So he is the ultimate overpowered, character, but he's stuck and trying to figure it out. And he realizes that he has to take the bait from this face dancer. Like he can literally see that if he turns it down, it's going to be catastrophic. Although he does refuse to bring Chani along, which is the other request that is there, and to put her at risk. And you also do have the revelation that Chani, after trying an old Fremen diet or whatever to try and do a cleanse or something, she finally gets off the drugs that Irulan has been secretly feeding her, and so she is now pregnant. And so Paul is excited for the birth of their daughter, which is coming, but we know from Chani that it's going to be a difficult birth. It's a difficult pregnancy. So we have all of that looming.
Mm.
So coming back next week, we'll pick it up with walking into the trap and the stone burner. And I don't think we do Tilda Swinton this week.
No, I think we have to wait till the end.
Okay. Fair enough.
I think yes, for our recurring segment, Who Would Tilda Swinton Play in This Book? Let's do it at the end once we fully considered the work as a whole.
Sounds good.
But listeners should be thinking of their answer now and can write us.
They won't be surprised.
Yeah.
So then the second thing is, what have we learned? What have we learned about Dune 2020 from the first half of Messiah? Like what do we think Denny should be thinking about that he can reflect in here?
It makes me really want to know how he's going to handle the concerns that Paul has about the jihad that take place between books 1 and 2, because I think it's in book 1, as we talked about on this podcast, it's not really understood how it was avoided in between the two. And so I think like sort of showing that struggle is really key. And I'd be interested to know how that gets put on screen.
Proto, how about you?
I think looking at this, I would love it if it doesn't necessarily fit into the first book story, if you fit in the Telexu in some way, because there's such a cool race and component of the Dune world that I would love to see what they come up with in terms of design and appearance and just the whole makeup of that group. So I would love that if he incorporated somehow, might stretch something, a scene on their planet or whatever to get some view of them.
And the Ix.
Yeah, and Ix, yeah.
That would be cool.
I could imagine, so as we talked about earlier tonight, the no denouement at the end of Dune, the fact that they're splitting it into 2 books, you could actually tack on something to give a little bit of the view in the direction between Dune and Dune Messiah at the end of the second movie.
You could see Duncan Idaho's corpse being delivered.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
That's hot. I love it.
That brings us to our letters segment.
Yes. I want to give a shout out to Corey Corcoran, on Instagram, who tagged Dune Pod and in a very cool post. So are you guys familiar with Jack Chick tracks? Like
yes.
The little comic books that are comic books meant to preach the gospel by like warning of like the sins of Dungeons and Dragons famously was one.
Of course.
Weed was one. And yeah. And there are these like really kind of poorly drawn black and white comics that get passed around. Anyway, he tagged us in a Jack Chick tract parody called Me and The Muad'Dib, which is a style of comic about preaching, the Messiah to come, and telling the story of Paul and, the salvation that he brought. And includes lines in it that says, Paul wants to help us, and that's why he became emperor. Not just help us, Paul Muad'Dib wants to save us, and by accepting him as emperor, you accept humanity. And it's got like little, little footnotes to like, the text in the same way that the Jack Trick one says.
Oh yeah.
Paul Atreides will always love us and will keep us safe. With his powers, he'll defend us the only way he can, for he is the Kwisatz Haderach, Muad'Dib, and the true leader of men. And then at the end, it's got like a couple, there's only one way to salvation, through the holy jihad of Muad'Dib. Oh and it's got like a couple prayers you can say. So it's really cool. I really like seeing it a lot. So I recommend it to folks. Go check that out on Corey Corcoran's Instagram page. Which again is his name spelled backwards.
We will provide a link to that Instagram post in the show notes, so check it out there. And also, I would like to say that I'm going to accept Paul Muad'Dib into my heart as my personal Lord and Savior.
I mean, it doesn't turn out well, so I don't know. Like, you're accepting the deaths of 61 billion people.
Oh, wait. Maybe not.
Yeah.
And that's it for this week's episode. I want to thank Jason and Proto for the enlightening conversation. Next week, join us as we complete Dune Messiah, as the action kicks into high gear and Paul makes his final choice. If you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a rating and a review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. Dune Pod is a production of Haitch Industries, a member of the Paper Keg Radio Syndicate. The episode was produced and edited by me, H. Our artwork is by Catcher, and our theme music was composed by Toby Forsman of Whipsong Music. Thanks for listening. We'll see everybody next week.